We are pretty much done talking about the stuff that we've been talking about all along. That is, the things that we've been talking about so far are called ranked voting methods. That is, voting methods in which the voters rank their choices, from A to D or whatever. We are going to keep on talking about voting, though, but there are, of course, other kinds of voting in the world other than systems in which you rank your choices. I wanted to talk about one more common voting method that's used in the real world, but it's not quite about rankings, although it is kind of similar. It's called approval voting. This is a very simple method to use, and it's a good, it actually works well when you're trying to decide something between alternatives, but you don't want to bother ranking your choices in order. All right, so it's a little simpler than these ranking systems. How it works is each voter, you have a list of the candidates, but instead of putting them in order, you just sort of like put a check next to the ones you like, and you don't put a check next to the ones you don't like. All right, so each voter indicates which candidates they approve of. But there's no ranking, there's no ordering. It's just, I like this one, I like this one, I don't like this one, I do like this one, that kind of thing. Which candidates they approve of. Which candidates of whom they approve, if you want to be grammatically old-fashioned about it. All right, which candidates they approve of. They don't put them in order, they just say, I like this, I don't like this, I do like this, that kind of thing. So for instance, a ballot looks like, A, B, C, D, and maybe I say, I like that one and I like that one. This means I approve of A and C, but I do not approve of C and D, right? Simpler than ranking your choices. The voters, simpler because your voters don't actually have to think too hard about it. They don't have to think, well, which one is actually the best? Which one is the second best? No, you just say which ones you like, which ones you don't like. All right? This is called approval voting because each person is indicating who they approve of or what, who or what they approve of. All right? And then how do you count up the votes? Then you just add up all the votes to get the result. All right? This is like a voting in an ordinary plurality election where you only choose your top choice. Only you're allowed to choose more than one if you want to. All right? This is how approval works. This might seem weird on the surface. Is it really okay to allow some people to vote for 3 different things while another one person maybe is only voting for one thing? Seems weird, but yeah, that is okay. There's nothing wrong about that. All right, you add up all the votes and get the result. All right, whoever has the most approvals, that's what each of those little checks is called. Whoever has the most approvals wins the election. Okay, so a typical election would look like. There's not really a lot to say about this because it's so simple. A typical election looks like. Maybe I'm going to make these sort of columns with numbers on the top, again indicating how many people voted in this way. But this time, what goes below is not a ordered ranking, but it's just which ones were approved. So I'm going to indicate this on a chart like this. And I'm going to say 23 people said, I like A and B. 37 people said, I like A and D. This is what a typical approval election looks like. There's no ranking of orderings, but there are different people who indicate different sets of approvals. Let's say 4 people like only C. Maybe I should put some of these in. 17 people say they like A and C. I just want to do one example. We'll add up and see who the winner is. You'll see it's much simpler than the other systems. Let's say 3 people approve of everybody. You allowed to do that? Yeah, if you want. Vote for everybody. It's a free country. Let's say 5 people vote for nobody. All right. You can do that too. And then let's say the last column, 7 people just said B. All right. This is what a typical approval voting election would look like. And how do we add up the results? You just count up how many times does A get approved? And there are 4 columns here, although you have to add up the numbers up top. These guys don't approve. The result. They don't like it when you let people vote for more than one person if they want to. A, how many votes does A get? You just count up. You count up, going across here. They get 23 from these people, 37 and 17 and 3. You've got to add that up. So it's 23 plus 37 plus 17 plus 3. That's 80, I think. Right? Add the other ones up. B gets 23 from the first column. They get 21 from that column down there. I'm just looking at wherever the B is checked off. And then 3 and then 7, right? This is 54. Keep going. C gets, the numbers are scrolled off. Add up the C's, 14 and 17 and 3. That's 34. And then finally the D's. I'm going to zoom out a little. The D's gets 37 and 21 and 3. That's 61. And so A wins. That's how we do it. All right. This is called approval voting. It's very simple. It's easy to add up all the answers. It's also easy for the voters to understand. If you're trying to convince a bunch of people to use something like instant runoff voting, it will take you a while to get them to even understand how the system works. But I think this is something that everybody can understand. You just say, you can vote for as many people as you want. Just check off who you like and who you don't like. That's how you do it. Approval voting. This is actually used, like I said, this is used in the real world. It's good for a sort of plurality-like election in the sense that all you're doing is asking people to check off who they like, and you're just counting up how many checks there are. So this is similar to plurality. It's good for a plurality-like election, but voters can choose more than one. That's the only difference, really. Voters can choose more than one person or whatever it is to vote for. It's easy to explain to people how it works, and it's easy to find the answers. You don't have to do some complicated system with a bunch of rounds or whatever. All right. Actually, the approval is used in the real world. This is used, among other things, it's used to elect the Pope. Can you believe it? This is how those old guys sitting around in the tower or whatever, they have a bunch of possible popes to choose from, and apparently the way that they vote about it is by this method. They get a list, and everybody can check off whoever they think would be a great pope. All right, check them all. If you think everybody would be great, you check everybody if you want to. Okay. Actually, the approval voting is also near and dear to my heart personally, because approval voting is what the Fairfield University faculty use when we do our faculty elections. We have faculty committees that decide things, decide what about new courses, new majors, or whatever. And this is a true story. When I came to Fairfield University, we used the plurality system for all of those elections. And I constantly grumbled to my friends and coworkers, the plurality system is a stupid thing to use in these elections. I think in general the plurality system is kind of overly simple, but especially in these elections when you had typically it's we want 2 people to be on this committee, and we have 15 different professors who say they want to be on the committee. And then everybody just the way we were doing it, everybody just chooses one person out of those 15. When in practice, I only know like 2 or 3 of those people, and they're basically all going to be good anyway. And I have to, choose 1 out of 15 that I like better than everybody else, when in reality, I don't actually have a strong feeling about this one way or another. This is the perfect system this is a perfect situation to use approval voting, when there are actually many of the options would be pretty good, and the stakes are sort of like ultra low in the sense that really, who cares who's on those committees? Like some people do care, but it's not like a political election or something. So anyway, I made a big whoop-de-doo about it, and I ended up changing the voting system that the faculty uses. So it's used to elect the Pope, and more importantly, Fairfield University faculty elections. I'm not. I tend to mind my own business around campus. If you talk to your other professors, they're likely not to know me. But say he's the guy who changed the voting system. They'd be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that guy. That's like my thing." So I'm very proud of that. It's like minimally important in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like I accomplished something at least at this place. All right, that's approval voting. Not much more to say about it. It is a good system to use, especially among people who are suspicious of complicated voting systems. I kind of like complicated voting systems just because I appreciate the mathematics of it. But most people get suspicious when you propose complicated voting systems. And approval is something that's, it's like very slightly more complicated than plurality, but still everybody can understand it. I had a few people who I had to convince pretty hard that this was a workable system. One person said to me, that's ridiculous. You can't allow some people to vote more than once. That's crazy. And I had to say, like, no, it's not crazy. It's fine. And eventually I convinced her. So anyway, that's all I need to say about approval voting. Any thoughts about approval voting? You might wonder, like, does it satisfy all these criteria? Like, am I going to put it in the chart? It doesn't really go in the chart because all those criteria were based on rankings, about what happens if you boost somebody in your rankings, whatever. Approval voting is not about rankings, and so it can't really be evaluated in the same way as those other systems. It's not a ranked voting system. And all those criteria are really just about ranked voting systems. All right, great. Approval voting, try it with your friends. It's a good way to make decisions when you have a lot of alternatives, and a lot of them are pretty good. Let's move on then to something completely different. So still on the topic of voting, but we're going to, what we say for the next couple weeks is actually going to be totally different, and it even will feel very different the way we're talking about it. What I want to talk about for the next couple weeks is called weighted voting. Weighted voting. This is also something that is very important in our politics, and there is, I've mentioned often presidential elections in the United States. There's one key ingredient in the U.S. presidential elections that I've never talked about. I don't know if you felt like we should be talking about it more often. It is the Electoral College. Everybody knows, maybe. All Americans are at least vaguely aware of the Electoral College, I think. It is the system that you use to decide who is going to become the president. It is only used to elect the president. That's the only thing that the Electoral College matters for, although it's also related to how they decide how many Congress people are in the Congress from each state. But anyway, the Electoral College. I remember having a discussion with my kid about the Electoral College when when Trump became the president. I had a little chat about my kid about how, Hillary. I had 2 daughters, and they were both really excited when they found out that the next president was likely to be a woman. because all the polls said that, Hillary they were saying like she had sort of an 80% chance of winning the election, which she didn't. And my kids were like, "What? Wasn't that lady supposed to win?" And I told my kid, well, actually, more people voted for the lady than for Trump, which is true. But in order to become the president, you don't gotta win more people's votes. You gotta win more points from the states. So the way that presidential votes are counted is not according to just count the votes. You count them up in each state, and per state you get a bunch of points, and then you add up those points, and that's what determines how you win. My kids were like, why you do it that way? Which a lot of people find themselves asking this question. A lot of people like the Electoral College. A lot of people really don't like the Electoral College. And unfortunately, it's hard to, I try to be sort of nonpartisan when I talk about politics in this class. Unfortunately, in the real world, the people who like the Electoral College tend to be Republicans, and the people who don't like it tend to be Democrats. And the reason is because, at least over the past 20 years or so, the Electoral College gives a bonus to Republicans and it hurts the Democrats. We know that Trump and also the George W. Bush, they both got fewer votes overall than their opponents did, but they became president because of the Electoral College picked them. So right now in our current political system, the Republicans are benefiting from the Electoral College and the Democrats are hurt by it. And so it becomes hard to express an opinion without sounding like you're a partisan. If you say, I don't like the Electoral College, people will say, oh, well, that's just because you're a radical leftist, Democrat, socialist, liberal. And if you say, oh, I actually do like the Electoral College, then people say, oh, then you're a conservative, fascist Republican. It is a mathematical thing, though, and apart from the partisan realities of it, I want to talk about the Electoral College. So it is a weighted voting system. The word weighted means that there are different entities which are casting votes, and their votes count for different amounts. So the Electoral College is a weighted voting system. What that means is different bodies, which could be individual people, or they could be, in the case of the Electoral College, they are the states. Different bodies vote, and each one's vote counts for a different amount. This is what a weighted voting system means. All right, and these amounts, these are called the weights. They're not called that in the Electoral College, but when we talk about weighted voting systems, we're going to call those the weights. It's like how many points you get from each of the different actors in the election. All right, so in the real Electoral College, the votes are according to populations of states, and the biggest state by population is California, which gets 55 votes. I think this is right. Actually, I didn't double check these numbers. These numbers change every so often based on changing populations of the states. Texas gets 38 votes. That's the next biggest. Florida gets 29 votes. Also New York, the state of New York, gets 29, etc. The smaller states get less. The smallest state by Electoral College votes is Delaware, which gets 3. All right. This is why people care a lot, for instance, about the results in Florida, whereas they don't care much at all about the results in Delaware. All right. In fact, Florida is one of the most important states that people really care about in our politics because, at least these days, California is regarded as reliably Democrat. Texas is reliably Republican. Florida is kind of the biggest of the states where they could go either way. And so that's where the politicians spend a lot of effort campaigning in Florida. But anyway, whoever wins, so the way it really works is whoever gets the most votes in each state gets all those points. Actually, there are some exceptions. So, like I said, there are many people who believe that the Electoral College system is a bad thing for democracy. And these rules have been changed a little bit. So the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska actually allocate their points proportionally. And so if the vote in the state of Maine is kind of even, then they will give their Electoral College points evenly to the two choices. So except for Maine and Nebraska, which allocate proportionally. But the other states don't do that. A lot of people don't like the system, but it's hard to untangle that from people who really care about democracy versus people who are just being partisans and want their own party to win more, and so they're willing to change the system to help themselves win. I might as well tell you, I don't really like the Electoral College system. I think it is undemocratic. I mean, I think everybody would agree that it is in some sense undemocratic if for any reason you're going to ignore the total number of votes and do the results in some other way. That automatically has some amount of undemocraticness. I think people who like the Electoral College system say the United States is not meant to be a direct democracy. It's meant to be a republic in which the nation as a whole is divided into individual states, and those individual states act as full states in building our government. And so it doesn't make sense to mix together, say, the votes of people in New York and the votes of people in Texas and count them as if they were on equal footing. I personally think that's kind of bogus, but that's, according to the history of our nation, that is actually the way that the nation was meant to be founded. And I think this has to do with the fact that in the early days of the United States, we really wanted to convince other bodies to become states. And, we wanted, say, Texas to become a state. And Texas was like, hey, why do we want to be part of you guys? We got our own thing going here. And we said, hey, if you join the United States, you're not just going to be like assimilated into everybody else. You're going to get to maintain your like distinctive Texasness. When we vote for the president, you guys decide who you want to be the president. You're not going to get mixed in with everybody else. This was the idea at the beginning. I think it is good for Americans today to think about, is that really how America functions today? I live in Connecticut. I was born in Massachusetts. I don't actually think of myself as a citizen of a different kind of thing. We don't really think of America in that way anymore. So it is appropriate, I think, to reevaluate. But anyway, these are all issues about the Electoral College system. Let's talk about weighted voting systems in general. I would like to know, so a basic question that we're going to be asking in weighted voting systems. Basic question. How do we judge who has the most, not the most, but let me say, who has what amount of power in a weighted voting system? What is interesting to me about weighted voting is this question here, which seems like a totally obvious question, but actually the answer is much more complicated than it might appear. How do we judge who has what amount of power in a weighted voting system? When you look at the Electoral College, for instance, you can ask yourself, in this system, which state has the most power? And the answer is obviously California. And which state has the least power? is Delaware, right? Because they're at the bottom. In the case of the Electoral College, that's true, what I just said. It is true that California has the most power and Delaware has the least power. But this is not always the case. In a weighted voting system, it's not always so easy to tell who has the most power and who has the least power and how the different power relationships exist. Let me say, I'll try and give you an example that is more complicated. Sorry, I just realized I wrote juge, not judge. Judge. Huge. Huge. That's what our former president liked to say. Let me give you some terms, and then before we leave today, I want to show you an example which I hope you will think is interesting. So, some basic terminology here. In a weighted voting system, I've already been using these words a little bit. Each voter has a weight, which is like how many votes they get to cast when they vote for things. All right? And also, there is a quota, which is required in order to win. In the Electoral College, it's how many votes do you need to win? 270, right. So and in order for the system to work properly, everybody has to know what are the weights and also what is the quota, how much do you need to win. So the quota is the threshold of votes needed to win. All right. Now, in many, most of the time when you do elections like this, the threshold to win is just 50% of the total number of votes, right? And that's how the Electoral College works. You have to get, well, more than 50% of the total number of votes. I think in theory it is possible to tie in the Electoral College, and then, anybody know what happens then? I think that then the Congress votes and decides who will be the president. Anyway, there is a threshold that's required to win. Check it out. Here is an interesting example, weird example. Let's say, this is not about the Electoral College, I'm just going to invent another weighted voting system. Let's say we have 5 voters, and the weights are like this. The weights are 10, 12, 5, 1, and 1. All right, and I have to tell you what the quota is. The quota is 20. So you have to get to 20 to win. There are 5 voters who have those weights. All right, now I'm going to try to convince you in the next 10 minutes. This is not an easy question to tell who has the most power in this system and how much power does each of these people have. I mean, it's not so hard, but if I ask you who has the most power, I think you would be naturally inclined to say the 12 has the most power. And who has the least power? The ones would have the least. And who's, kind of in the middle? The 5 and the 10, I guess, are kind of in the middle. The 10, I would assume the 10 has more power than the 5, but less than the 12, right? Actually, what I said, all of that stuff is not true. Some of it is true, but not all of it is true. Consider, I think, the 10 and the 12 are actually the same amount of power in this system. Anybody agree with me? Yes? And can explain why? The 10 and the 12 are actually the same in this system. Even though the 12, obviously 12 is more than 10, you feel like the 12, the person with 12 has more power, but it's not so. Yeah?
Well, don't they both need all the others to win?
Yeah, you got to get to 20 in order to win, right? And if you think about how these numbers can add together, just the different ways that you could add these numbers up, I think in order to get to 20, you need both the 10 and the 12, right? It's not possible for these other ones to add up to make up the difference, okay? So in this case, the 10 and the 12 are needed. They are both needed to reach the quota. And what about the 5, the 1, and the 1? If you think about it for a moment, I think you will agree, there is no scenario in which those votes matter, right? They can't possibly add up to meet the quota. And if the quota is already met, then their votes don't matter anyway, right? In this case, the 10 and the 12 are both needed to reach the quota. The 5, the 1, and the 1 have no effect at all. Whether they vote or not, whether they contribute their points to the total, it doesn't matter. Like, it's because it's something about the particular arrangement of these numbers is such that the 10 and the 12 are the only ones that can actually meaningfully contribute to the quota. The 5, the 1, and the 1 don't matter at all. And so, what I said before about the 12 is the most powerful and then the 10 is a little bit less, that's not true actually. The 12 and the 10 are the same amount of power. And the other ones, the 5 is in the middle somewhere. No, actually the 5 is the same as the 1 and the 1. All right? So I hope that you've been convinced that this kind of weighted voting scenario there's a lot like beneath the surface that you won't notice unless you look carefully at these numbers. This should actually cause you to doubt a little bit when I said in the Electoral College here, California is the most important, followed by Texas. Actually, is that really true? Or perhaps, is it true that actually these are equally powerful? It's not obvious, right? So I will tell you, in fact, it is really true that in the real Electoral College, the California is actually slightly more powerful than the Texas. But it's not obvious, all right? It seems like that's obvious just because this number is bigger than that number, but that's actually not enough to convince ourselves that one is actually more powerful than the other. All right? So this is the kind of thing that we're going to talk about. Big questions to talk about would be, well, how exactly do we measure power in a system like this? And the answer is, I'm not going to tell you, it's complicated, right? I'm just going to say it's not enough to just look at the weights. Because the weights often will conceal more complicated relationships between the things. Just because one number is bigger than another doesn't mean that that person actually has more power than the other one. All right. Let me just say, we got 5 more minutes left. I can say a few more things here. The way that we typically will write an example system of a weighted voting system, we typically, like when I described that example there, I said it sort of in words here. I said, let's say we got 5 voters, and these are the weights, and this is the quota. I'm not usually going to write, I don't want to write a bunch of words like that every time. All that's important in this information here is what is the quota and what are the weights. All right, so the way that we're going to write this, we typically write it like this. This is sort of a fancy looking way of writing that system. So I'm going to put this bracket, and then the quota goes first. That's the 20 in that example. And then I'm just going to write down each of the weights in order from biggest to smallest. So in that example, it was 12, 10, 5, 1, 1. All right. So like when you do homework problems about this or something, I'm going to say, here's an example of a weighted voting system. And I'll just write something like that. The first number is the quota. And then these ones are the weights. All right. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. So we'll have we'll talk, all week next week about this.